You probably know your brain has two hemispheres, the right hemisphere, or the right brain, and the left hemisphere, or the left brain. But what do they do? And most importantly, how do we know what each is responsible for? Let's explore. It is generally known that each hemisphere is responsible for different functions. If you think about it, we call creative people right-brained people, while we refer to those that are more logical left-brained people. By the way, this is not true, it's just an exaggeration of how things actually work, but it goes to prove the point that we are aware that each hemisphere is responsible or governs different abilities. So, what is each of them actually responsible for? The left hemisphere is responsible for things such as understanding language, speech, so our ability to speak using language, logical skills such as calculation and analysis, but is also processing time and sequences. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is handling aspects such as spatial construction, facial recognition, introspection, the ability to understand big picture concepts, but is also processing the emotional tone of the language. It is important to note that the hemispheres are not solely responsible for more complex activities. Let's consider listening, like you're doing now. In order to understand me, you need areas in both your hemispheres to be active. So the left hemisphere will help you understand the meaning of the words I'm saying, but you'll need the right hemisphere to help you interpret the emotional tone of the language I'm using. Or when you're doing math problems, you will for sure need your logical skills and use calculation, but you'll not be able to tackle more complex problems without seeing the big picture or maybe even spatial construction. Think of geometry. So how do we know what each hemisphere is responsible for? Well, nowadays we have a lot of modern technology that can help us with that by, for example, scanning the brain while performing different activities. But in this video, we are going to focus on split brain research. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. You take one brain, you split it in two, and you do research on it. So there you go, split brain research. So how do you split a brain? By cutting the corpus callosum, which you can see here in red. The corpus callosum is a band of nerve fibers that connects the two hemispheres and lets information travel from one to the other. So because of the corpus callosum, the two hemispheres are always up to date with the information the other one is receiving and processing. Cutting the corpus callosum is quite a radical and permanent procedure that is sometimes done to people who are suffering from severe epilepsy. That is because a seizure can start in one hemisphere and travel through the corpus callosum to the other hemisphere, inflicting major damage to the brain. And in order to prevent such a generalized seizure, neurosurgeons cut the corpus callosum, pretty much disconnecting the two hemispheres. Not to get overly dramatic here, but they're kind of creating two separate brains inside one individual. That sounds drastic, which it is, but the person that has a split brain has a rather normal life after surgery. By no means you would be able to identify such an individual from a crowd, let's say. So why is that? Well, before we get there, you have to know something about contralateral control. Contralateral control pretty much means that the right hemisphere coordinates the left side of your body, while the left hemisphere coordinates the right side of your body. So here is an interesting fact. Not only that your brain coordinates the body the other way around, so left hemisphere to right side of the body and right hemisphere to left side of the body, but it's also doing it upside down, which means your toes are coordinated by a region found in the upper side of the brain, while the mouth and the tongue in the lower part. Why so complicated? But there is more. The eyes send information to both hemispheres, but in a more complicated way. Here's how it works. When we think of vision, we have to think in matter of visual fields. So you have the center, the right visual field, and the left visual field. The other way around for you. When we think of the eyes, we have to think in halves as well. So each eye has two halves, the right half and the left half. Still with me? Let's try this. So the eyes, here's the center, to the right visual field, and to the left visual field. As mentioned, we will have to think of each eye as two halves. Here is where it gets a bit tricky. The right visual field gets projected on the retina on the left half of each eye, so here, while the left visual field on the right half of the retinas, so here. Now let's see how the information projected on the retinas actually reaches the brain. Well, the left halves of the retinas transmit information to the left hemisphere, while the right halves to the right hemisphere. Note that information from both eyes reaches both hemispheres. So here's an interesting one. Experiments show that if an image is shown to either the visual fields for less than a tenth of a second, so that's 0.1 seconds, the information would only travel to one hemisphere. That is because the eye would not have the time to turn to be able to see the image with both halves. For example, if an image is shown in the left visual field for less than a tenth of a second, it will be visible to only the right half of the retinas, therefore reaching only the right hemisphere. It is important to notice this overlap and know that this transition is not done via the corpus callosum. So when cutting the corpus callosum, this actually stays intact and information still travels from one eye to both hemispheres. So back to split brain patients and how their lives post-surgery are rather normal. It is true that each hemisphere coordinates the other side of the body. So let's say if a person with a split brain injures their left leg, information would travel and only reach the right hemisphere, which can be a problem given that the right hemisphere does not govern speech. But given that they would look with both their eyes to the injured leg, actually one eye should be enough, thanks evolutionary biology, because information would reach both hemispheres this way, just like anyone without a split brain. There would be indeed a slight time difference, but nevertheless information would reach both hemispheres. And since both hemispheres are processing the same information, well, their lives are rather normal. So if information does reach both hemispheres, how do we know then from split brain patients what each hemisphere is responsible for separately? Well, here is where Roger Sperry comes in. Roger Sperry pioneered the work on split brain research, and he actually went and won a Nobel Prize for it in 1981. He conducted some really interesting experiments that show how each hemisphere is responsible for different activities. Now let's look at 3 of his experiments. In all 3 experiments, a person with a split brain is seated in front of a screen and asked to look at a fixed point in the center. In all 3, words are shown for less than a tenth of a second in either the left visual field or both visual fields. In the first experiment, the patient is shown 2 words, one in each visual field, for less than a tenth of a second, so information travels only to the opposite hemisphere, but only to one hemisphere. When asked, "What did you see?" the patient can easily report on what they saw on the right visual field, so processed by the left hemisphere, which governs speech, but they seem to be unaware of the existence of a second word. In the second experiment, a word is shown on the left side of the screen, again for less than a tenth of a second, so information only travels to the right hemisphere. Behind the screen, outside of their sight, several objects are placed. The patient is asked with their left hand to grab one of these objects that is represented by the word they saw on the screen, and without any issues, the patient just does that. When asked, "What did you see? What are you holding in your hand?" the patient is unaware and cannot answer the question. In a third experiment, the patient is first shown a list of words, really common words. So they are reading with both their eyes, they are processing with both hemispheres. Then they're sitting down in front of the screen, and on the left side of the screen, again, for less than a tenth of a second, a word from the list is shown. Now they're asked with their left hand to write down the word they saw outside of their sight again, and they can just do that without any issue. When asked, "What did you see? What did you write down?" the patient just starts guessing words from the list, proving that they have no idea what they saw or what they wrote down. Now, when we're asking the patient to say something, we're pretty much asking them to use their left hemisphere. but their left hemisphere didn't see anything because nothing was projected on the right side of the screen, or they didn't write it down or touch any object with the right hand, which is controlled by the left hemisphere. So no information actually reached the left hemisphere. So when asked, tell me something, the left hemisphere cannot. It's just blank. If you found this even remotely interesting, you have to check out the video I added for you in the description. In this video, Professor Michael Gazzaniga, who actually worked alongside Roger Sperry, conducts some further experiments on his split brain patient, Joe. So now let's reflect a bit on this. Imagine this being you. You can see a word. You know its meaning because you can grab the object represented by that word. You can even write it down. But when asked about it, when asked, what did you write? What are you holding in your left hand right now? Well, nothing. There is nothing you can say. So what do you think? Is this splitting the brain? Or just creating two? Let me know in the comments. I will see you next time.